Question. Since man ceased to believe that his sufferings were a direct punishment from God, is he not ashamed of them and resentful of them? Ouspensky. It looks like that, but really, he will never give up his sufferings. When he decides to give them up, he becomes free of them. It seems a simple thing, but when it comes to practice, he finds he cannot give them up because his sufferings have already become a habit. And so although he decides in his mind to give them up, he still continues to feel the same. Nevertheless, to get rid of unnecessary suffering, the first step is to decide to give it up in one's mind. When a man makes this decision, after some time he will give it up. But as long as his mind is hypnotized by this suffering, he will not make the effort. Question. If he gives up his suffering, what will he get in exchange? Ouspensky. He will get in exchange the absence of suffering. That is why he does not want to give it up. Question. What method can one use to sacrifice suffering? Ouspensky. Realization of values. But there are different kinds of suffering. Sometimes an effective way to destroy suffering is to see that it belongs to the imaginary part of yourself. Division into real and imaginary is very useful. The general idea is that you cannot get anything for nothing. You have to sacrifice something. But what to sacrifice? One person does not want to sacrifice one thing, another person another thing. The answer is sacrifice our suffering, negative emotions, negative imagination, and all that. It is a very good sacrifice, only it is very difficult, because we are ready to sacrifice any pleasure, but not suffering. Question. How can real suffering exist if you say that the emotional center has no negative part? Ouspensky. In the description of man in this system, we come up against the impossibility of describing things as they are. They can only be described approximately. In some cases, in the description of the human machine, the differences are so great that it is better to say a thing does not exist at all than to say that one thing is big and another small. This refers to the emotional center, because there are emotions that are not negative yet very painful, and there is a center for them, but it occupies such an infinitesimal part compared with negative emotions that are not real that it is better to say the emotional center has no negative part. Question. How can you explain the great amount of suffering that exists in the world? Ouspensky. This is a very interesting question. From the point of view of the work, it is possible to find at least a logical form of solution to this problem. In organic life, man must be regarded as an experiment of the great laboratory. In this laboratory, all possible kinds of experiments are made, and they have to be made by means of suffering to bring about some kind of fermentation. In some way, suffering is necessary for this. All the cells of this experiment have to suffer. And because of that, their tendency is to avoid suffering, to have as little of it as possible, or to run away. If some of these cells break this tendency and accept suffering voluntarily, they can rid themselves of it and become free. Suffering, voluntary suffering, can become schoolwork. Nothing is more difficult, and at the same time nothing can create so much force as voluntary suffering. The idea of development is to create an inner force, and how can a man put himself to the test without suffering? From one point of view, the whole of organic life exists for planetary purposes. From another point of view, it exists only for the sake of those who escape. This suffering is the highest product of organic life on earth. The rest are merely byproducts, and the highest is always the most important. We are far from understanding this idea of suffering, but if we realize that small things can be attained with small suffering, and big things with big suffering, we shall understand that it will always be proportionate. At the same time, we must remember one thing. We have no right to invent suffering. Also, we have the right to accept suffering for ourselves, but we have no right to accept it for other people. Question: but should we not work for the relief of suffering? Ouspensky: as much as we can, but there is suffering which can be relieved and suffering which cannot be relieved because it depends on bigger causes. Sleeping people have to suffer. Maybe there's a great cosmic purpose in this suffering, because only suffering can eventually wake them up. Question: is there a definite amount of suffering to be borne in the world? Ouspensky: probably for the purposes of possible evolution, everyone must be surrounded by enormous possibilities of suffering. Evolution depends on man's attitude, if he accepts suffering and tries not to identify with it. It may be that this whole law was created so that he could become stronger, because strength can only be created by suffering. Question: it was said that one of the methods of struggling with negative emotions is thinking differently. I do not quite understand what thinking differently means. Ouspensky: it means to take some subject which produces emotion and think about it, trying not to justify yourself or to accuse other people. That will be different thinking. Although there are negative emotions that cannot be destroyed in this way, for they need stronger methods, this method must be tried first in every case. The whole difficulty lies in negative emotions. We enjoy them so much that we have no interest in anything else. In terms of this whole work, the first point is how to remember yourself, how to be more aware. And then you will find that negative emotions are one of the chief factors which make us unable to remember ourselves. So one thing cannot go without the other. You cannot struggle with negative emotions without remembering yourself more. And you cannot remember yourself more without struggling with negative emotions. If you remember these two things, you will understand everything better. Try to keep these two ideas, which are connected, in mind.